Avery had never been the kind of woman who spooked easily, and she had built her entire adult life around that fact. She was 34 years old, and she had spent those years trusting what she could see and measure and explain. She did not believe in God or ghosts or anything that could not be proven with evidence, and she had no patience for people who did. Faith had always struck her as a crutch for people who were not comfortable sitting with uncertainty, and she had made her peace with uncertainty a long time ago. The farmhouse had been a practical decision more than anything else. After separation from Ray, she needed somewhere quiet and somewhere cheap, and the listing had checked both boxes without asking anything more of her. The property sat at the end of a gravel road, about 4 miles outside a small town, that had exactly one gas station, and a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon. Dead fields stretched out on either side of the driveway, and a thick tree line along the back of the property blocked the nearest neighbor from view. She had moved in on a Saturday in early October with 2 truckloads of boxes and a determination to get on with her life without ceremony or sentiment. The first weeks had been unremarkable in the way she preferred. She worked remotely during the day at a desk she had set up near the kitchen window and spent her evenings reading or walking the perimeter of the property with a flashlight out of habit more than any real purpose. The farmhouse was old, and it made noises at night, but she cataloged each one and assigned a cause and moved on without losing sleep over any of them. Pipes expanding and contracting, wind pushing through gaps in the eaves. The settling of old with adjusting to the dropping temperatures of early autumn. None of it troubled her, because none of it was inexplicable once she thought it through. She was not a woman who needed mystery to feel alive, and she was not a woman who enjoyed being unsettled. She preferred things that held still long enough to be examined. The Wednesday night the knocking started, she had been sitting at her kitchen table finishing the last of a cold cup of coffee, just past 11. She had been reading through a work report on her laptop and half listening to the wind moving across the roof when the knock came at the front door. It was not loud, but it was deliberate. 3 slow, even knocks spaced with careful pause between each one, like whoever was standing on the other side had thought about the rhythm before committing to it. Avery set down her mug and walked to the door without rushing, because hurrying to answer a knock at 11 at night was not something she was willing to do. She was mildly annoyed at the hour and mildly curious about who would be standing at the end of the gravel road in the dark with no car in the driveway that she had heard pull up. She turned on the porch light and looked through the narrow window beside the door before putting her hand on the knob. There were 2 children standing on her porch, a boy and a girl, both somewhere between 8 and 10 years old by her estimate. They were dressed in dark clothing that struck her as slightly wrong in a way she could not immediately name. The fabric looked older than it should have been, and the cuts and the collars were not right for the current decade. They looked like photographs of children more than children themselves. They stood side by side with their arms hanging straight at their sides, and their faces tilted upward just enough to aim at the window where she was standing. Avery opened the door because she was a practical woman, and there was no rational reason not to open her own door to 2 small children standing on her porch. She stepped into the doorway and looked down at them and asked what they needed. The girl spoke first. She said they needed to come inside. She did not say they were lost or cold, or that there had been an accident somewhere down the road. She did not mention parents or a car or a reason. She just said they needed to come inside, and she said it with a patience that did not belong on the face of a child that age. It was a patience of something that had been waiting for a long time and had learned not to show urgency, because urgency was not necessary. Avery looked at the girl and then at the boy and started to form a response, and that was when the porch light caught their eyes directly. The light was not strong, but it was enough. Their eyes were black, not dark brown, catching the shadows at a poor angle, not the wide pupils of children standing in low light, black from edge to edge with no iris visible and no white at all, just flat solid black where the eye should have had color and depth and life. She stood in the doorway, and something moved through her chest that she did not immediately recognize because she had not felt it very often. It was not quite fear, because fear required her to accept that something was genuinely wrong, and her mind was still running hard to find the explanation that would make this ordinary. It was something closer to the sensation of stepping onto ice and feeling it give slightly underfoot without breaking. The ground was still there, but the certainty of it had shifted. She told the children she could not let strangers inside her home, and that they needed to go back to wherever they came from. The boy spoke this time, and he used the same flat, patient tone the girl had used, and he said they just needed to come inside for a little while. There was nothing threatening in the words themselves. There was nothing threatening in the way he stood or the expression on his face, which was perfectly still. The threat was in the absence of everything that should have been there. No fear, no cold, no desperation, no childhood at all behind those black eyes looking up at her from her own front porch. She told them no a second time, and she closed the door and turned the deadbolt and stood in the hallway with her shoulders against the wood and her heart moving faster than she wanted to acknowledge. She waited and she listened. There were no footsteps crossing the porch boards, no voices, no sound of movement at all. She stood there for 2 full minutes, counting her own breathing, before she turned and looked back through the narrow window. The porch was empty. She went through every lock in the house, starting at the front door and working methodically through the back door, and all 6 windows on the ground floor, checking each one twice before moving to the next. She told herself as she moved from room to room that the eyes had been a trick of the light. She ran through the possibilities with the same deliberate focus. She brought the problems at work, a medical condition affecting both children at once, specialized contact lenses, an unusual reflection from the porch bulb against dark irises at a specific angle. She listed each option out loud in the kitchen because hearing them spoken made them feel more concrete. By the time she got back to the table, she had settled on the angle of the light as the most reasonable answer, and she sat back down with her cold coffee and held on to that answer with both hands. She went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark and let the explanation run through her head one more time and told herself she was satisfied with it. She was almost asleep when a different thought surfaced uninvited. She had been looking directly at them under a direct light source. The angle argument required the light to be bad and the angle to be extreme, and she had been standing close enough that neither of those conditions had been true. She pushed the thought down and closed her eyes and eventually slept. The next morning, she walked out to the porch before making coffee. The boards were old and dusty along the edges near the railing where foot traffic never reached. She stood and looked at the surface of the porch for a long time. There were no footprints anywhere near the door. There were no scuff marks on the steps leading up from the dead grass below. The thin layer of dust along the railing was completely undisturbed. She stood in the gray morning light and stared at the clean porch and felt the explanation she had built the night before develop a crack she could not immediately fill. She went inside and made her coffee and opened her laptop and started her workday and said nothing to anyone about what she had seen. She worked through the morning with the focus she always brought to tasks that needed doing, and she did not look at the front door more than twice before noon. By afternoon, she had almost convinced herself that the whole thing was behind her. A strange night and a strange moment, and nothing more than that. She ate dinner at the kitchen table as the light outside dropped and the fields went gray and then dark. She cleaned her plate and washed it and dried it and put away. She poured a glass of water and sat back down at the table with her book. The porch light was off. She had not turned it on. She told herself she had simply forgotten and reached over and switched it on and looked at the window above the sink that faced the front of the house and saw nothing but her own reflection staring back at her from the dark glass. She read 3 more pages before she realized she had not retained a single word of them. She set the book down and sat with the quiet of the house around her and tried to locate the feeling that had been sitting low in her chest since the night before. It was not fear. She was not ready to call it fear. It was more like the awareness of a variable she had not yet accounted for sitting just outside the edge of her model and refusing to resolve into something clean. She was a woman who did not rest well with unresolved variables. She got up and checked the front door lock without turning on any other lights, and then stood at the narrow window and looked out at the empty porch for a long moment before going to bed. The fields were dark, and the tree line at the back of the property was a solid black mass against a slightly less black sky. Nothing moved out there. Nothing stood at the edge of the light, looking back at her. She told herself that was enough, and went upstairs and lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her in the dark. Sleep came slowly and without comfort, and when it finally arrived, it was thin and full of silence that felt less like rest and more like waiting. She woke once at 3 a.m. to complete silence and lay still for a moment, listening before closing her eyes again. She did not get up to check the door. She told herself there was nothing to check. Thursday came and went without incident through the daylight hours, and Avery moved through her work with a kind of focused efficiency that had always served her well when something was pulling at the edge of her attention. She answered emails and joined a conference call, and ate lunch standing at the kitchen counter, and did not once look at the front door while the sun was up. That was the agreement she had made with herself overnight. Daylight was for working and for being a reasonable person, and nighttime was apparently for whatever Wednesday had been. She was not going to let one strange night reorganize her entire relationship with her own house. She was better than that. She had always been better than that. By late afternoon, she had her notes program open on her laptop and had typed out a brief account of what she had seen the night before in plain, factual language with no editorializing. 2 children, approximate ages 8 to 10, dark clothing, unusual eye appearance likely attributable to lighting conditions or an undiagnosed medical condition affecting both individuals. She read it back to herself, and it sounded exactly as straightforward as she needed it to sound. She saved the file and closed it and made dinner and ate it without incident. The knock came at 11:17, according to the clock on the microwave. She knew the time because she had been watching the clock for the last hour, without fully admitting to herself that she was doing so. 3 knocks, the same deliberate spacing as the night before. She walked to the door and turned on the porch light and looked through the narrow window and felt the breath move out of her in a slow, controlled exhale that she had to consciously manage. There were 3 of them this time. The same boy and girl from the night before stood in the same positions on the porch with their arms at their sides and their black eyes aimed upward at the window. Beside the girl stood a second girl of similar age wearing a dark dress with a white collar that looked like it belonged in a different era entirely. All 3 of them were perfectly still. Avery stood at the window and looked at them for a longer moment than she had the night before because she was documenting now, and documentation required observation. The eyes were the same, black from edge to edge on all 3 of them with no variation and no depth. She noted that the new child stood closer to the door than the other 2 had stood on Wednesday. She noted that all 3 of them were standing on the porch boards rather than the steps, meaning they had crossed the threshold of the porch without being invited to do so. She noted these things with a detached focus of someone taking inventory, and then she opened her notes program on her phone and typed them in while still standing at the window. The children did not move while she typed. They did not shift their weight or look at each other, or show any sign that standing motionless on a porch in the cold for an extended period was unusual or uncomfortable. The girl in the dark dress had her head tilted at a slightly different angle than the others, and Avery noted that too. She did not open the door. She told them through the glass that she could not help them and they needed to leave. The original girl spoke and said they needed to come inside, and her voice carried through the door with a clarity that should not have been possible through solid wood. Avery told them no and stepped back from the window and stood in the dark hallway and listened. Silence again. No footsteps. No voices. She waited 4 minutes this time before checking the window. The porch was empty. She went through her lock check with the same methodical approach as the night before, and then sat at the kitchen table with her phone and read back through her notes. She added 2 more observations. First, that the voices carried through the door at a volume inconsistent with the distance and the barrier between them. Second, that the new child had been standing closer to the door than the original 2, which suggested either that the group had a spatial pattern she had not yet identified, or that they were testing the proximity of the entrance in increments. She read both observations back and felt the part of her brain that preferred clean explanations start working harder than usual. She went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark thinking about increments. Friday began with gray skies and a wind that pushed dead leaves across the gravel driveway in long scraping lines. Avery worked through the morning and into the afternoon with her notes file open in a second window beside her work documents. She added observations from memory. The clothing on all 3 children had looked dry despite the cold, damp air. She had not noticed their breath misting in the chill the way hers would have. She had not thought about that in the moment, but sitting with it now in the flat, gray daylight, it registered as significant. She added it to the file without deciding what it meant. She called Ray in the early afternoon not because she expected him to be useful, but because she wanted to say the situation out loud to another person, and Ray was the only person she had a reason to call. He answered on the 3rd ring, and she told him about the children in the most neutral language she could manage. He was quiet for a moment, and then said it was probably local kids messing with the new person on the road. She said she did not think that was it. He said she had always had a tendency to overcomplicate things that were simple. She thanked him for his time and ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand before setting it face down on the table. She ate dinner early and watched the light outside drop faster than it seemed to have any right to. By 9, she had her phone on the table beside her coffee with the notes file open, and a fresh entry started with the date and time already filled in. By 10:30, she was watching the clock again. The knock came at 11, and this time, she was already at the window when the sound finished. For children on the porch. The original 3 plus a boy standing at the very edge of the top step with 1 foot raised slightly as though he had just arrived and had not yet decided whether to commit to porch fully. All 4 sets of eyes were black. All 4 faces were tilted up toward the window with the same flat expression that contained nothing she could read. She documented everything. She noted the position of each child relative to the door and relative to the positions they had held the night before. She noted that the newest child was standing at the boundary of the porch rather than on it, which continued the pattern she had identified. She noted the clothing on each one, and the approximate ages, and the absence of breath vapor in the cold air. She told them no through the glass before any of them spoke, and the original girl said they only needed to come inside for a little while, in that same patient, ageless voice, and Avery said no again and moved away from the window. She did her lock check and sat at the table and finished her notes and read through all 3 nights of entries in sequence. The pattern was clear and consistent, and the clarity of it did not comfort her the way patterns usually did. 1 new child each night. Each night, they stood measurably closer to the house than the night before. Each night, the newest child stood at the outermost boundary of the group's previous position, as though they were mapping the approach in careful, deliberate stages. She sat with that observation for a long time. Then she opened a new document and started writing down everything she could remember about their eyes. The eyes were the detail that resisted every explanation she tried to build around them. She had spent 2 days constructing frameworks for the clothing and the stillness, and the voices carrying through the door. The clothing could be thrift store finds or a family with unusual taste. The stillness could be coach behavior from an adult, somewhere nearby running an elaborate prank. The voices carrying through the door could be a quirk of how sound moved through old wood on a cold night. Each of those explanations had gaps, but each one had enough structural integrity to stand on if she did not push it too hard. The eyes had no structure she could make stand. For children could not all have the same rare bilateral condition that left their eyes solid black with no visible iris and no visible white. For children could not all be wearing the same unusual contact lenses on multiple consecutive nights while standing on her porch in the dark. The light had been adequate on all 3 nights. She had been close enough on the first night to rule out distance as a factor. She sat at the kitchen table with the cursor blinking in her notes document and stared at the screen and felt the framework she had been building since Wednesday develop a fracture she could not paper over with another reasonable explanation. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and listened to house and ran the data through her head in different configurations, looking for an arrangement that would make it resolve into something she could file and close. The data did not cooperate. By 2 a.m, she had stopped trying to make it cooperate and had started instead cataloging what she actually knew without the filter of what she wanted it to mean. What she knew was that something was coming to her door every night. What she knew was that it was coming in increasing numbers. What she knew was that whatever was its solid black eyes moved closer to her house by a measurable increment each visit and made no sound when it left and left no trace of itself on the porch boards. She stared at the ceiling and held those facts without trying to arrange them into anything and felt the low, cold weight of them settle into her chest and stay there. She did not have a name for what she was feeling yet. She was still not ready to call it fear, but she lay awake until almost 3, and when she finally slept, it was not the sleep of a woman who had found her answer. Saturday morning arrived pale and cold, and she sat at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee and her notes file open and looked at what she had built over 3 nights of observation. It was thorough. It was organized. It was the most detailed account she had ever compiled of something she could not explain, and looking at it in the flat morning light, she felt for the first time that the act of documenting it had not made her feel more in control the way documentation usually did. It had only made the thing more real. She closed the laptop and sat with her coffee and looked at the window above the sink and thought about Saturday night and what the number would be when she looked through the narrow window beside the front door and what position they would have moved to and how much closer to the door the newest one would be standing than the last. By Saturday morning, Avery had stopped pretending the documentation was purely academic. She had 4 nights of notes sitting in a file on her laptop, and the pattern inside them was too clean and too consistent to be the work of neighborhood kids or a prank that someone had been running all week without a single slip. She opened her browser and typed in what she had seen and felt immediately foolish, and then kept reading anyway because the results were not what she expected. There were hundreds of accounts, forums and personal blogs and comment threads going back years with people describing the same thing in the same language from locations spread across the country and beyond it. 2 children at the door, black eyes, a request to come inside, the feeling of something wrong underneath the surface of everything they said and did. She read for 2 hours without stopping, and the accounts followed the same basic structure with enough variation in the details to make them feel less like a coordinated hoax and more like independent people trying to describe the same experience in their own words. Some of the posters described feeling physically ill when the children were near. Some described their pets refusing to go near the front of the house for days afterward. Some described the children returning night after night in growing numbers, which hit close enough to her own situation that she had to set the laptop down for a moment and look at the wall. She picked it back up and kept reading. The comments on every thread followed a predictable arc. People offered rational explanations in the early replies. Medical conditions, pranks, misidentification in low light, Then further down the thread, the tone would shift, and someone would say that no rational explanation covered all the details, and that what the poster was describing had been documented across cultures for a very long time under different names, but with the same core features. Those comments always drew pushback, but they also always drew agreement from people who had their own accounts to share. Then, inevitably near the bottom of every single thread, without exception, someone would tell the poster the same thing. They would say that only God could protect them now. They would say it plainly and without drama, like it was the most practical advice available and not a religious statement at all. Avery read those responses and felt the same contempt she always felt when people reached for the supernatural as a solution to something they had not yet thought through carefully enough. She had spent her whole life watching people use faith as a shortcut past the hard work of actually understanding something, and she was not going to start doing herself because a few forum posters had run out of better ideas. She closed several tabs and kept reading the ones with more detailed accounts. She found a thread where someone had compiled reported characteristics from dozens of separate encounters and laid them out in a list. The eyes were always fully black. The children always asked permission to enter rather than forcing their way in. They were always calm. They were always patient. They never showed physical signs of cold or discomfort regardless of the weather. Accounts that described letting them in ended one of two ways. Either the thread stopped entirely with no further posts from the original poster, or the person came back days later clearly different in some way they could not or would not fully describe. Avery read that last part twice. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the fact that she had not let them in, and she thought about that very carefully. Then she got up and made more coffee and sat back down and searched for anything that approached the subject from a research or investigative angle rather than a personal account. What she found was thinner and less satisfying. A few paranormal investigators who had documented cases, a journalist who had tried to trace the origin of the phenomenon and concluded it predated the internet by a significant margin, one academic paper from a folklore researcher that described similar entities in cultures that had no contact with each other, which Avery read 3 times because it was the only thing she found all morning that approached the subject the way she wanted to approach it. It still ended without a conclusion that helped her. She pushed the laptop aside in the early afternoon and walked through the house, slowly starting at the front door and moving room by room. She checked the locks out of habit, even though it was the middle of the day. She checked the windows on the ground floor and found them all secure. She stood in the back hallway that led to the basement door and looked at it for a moment before deciding she was not ready to go down there and turned back toward the kitchen. She ate something she did not taste and sat back down at the laptop and kept reading until the light outside started to change. It was while she was reading a thread from someone who described finding something in the walls of their house after the visit started that she remembered the previous owners. She had not thought much about them. The listing had said the property had been vacant for several years before she bought it, and the real estate agent had been vague about why in a way she had not pressed at the time, because the price had been right. She got up and went back to the hallway and stood in front of the basement door again, and this time she opened it and went down the stairs with her phone flashlight on, because the overhead bulb had been dead since she moved in. The basement was unfinished with concrete walls and a dirt floor in the far corner under the old support beams. There were a few things left behind by whoever had been there before. An old metal shelf with nothing on it, a rusted tool chest with a drawer stuck shut, a wooden workbench along one wall with a layer of dust, and a dark stain near one end that she did not look at for long. She swept the flashlight along the base of the walls and across the ceiling joists, and was about to go back upstairs when the light caught something she had missed. There was a narrow gap between the concrete wall and the old paneling that had been tacked up along one section of the basement, as though someone had tried to finish the space at some point. She crossed the basement and pulled at the edge of the paneling, and it came away from the wall more easily than it should have, which told her it had been moved before, Behind it, wedged into the gap between the paneling and the concrete, was a composition notebook with a water-damaged cover. She pulled it out and stood with it under the flashlight and opened the cover. The handwriting inside was small and cramped and had the quality of someone writing quickly under pressure. The first entry was dated decades earlier. She read the first page standing in the cold basement and did not move until she had read 3 more pages. The person who had written it had seen them too. The same children, the same black eyes, the same knocking at the same late hour, the same growing number each night, and the same creeping proximity. She turned the pages carefully because the paper was fragile and read as much as she could without damaging them. The entries grew shorter and more fragmented as they went on. The handwriting changed. It became less controlled and harder to follow, as though the person writing it had been doing so under increasing strain. The last entry was 4 words into a sentence that described something happening at the back of property near the tree line, and it stopped in the middle of the word, as though the pen had been set down in a hurry or had simply stopped being held. Avery stood in the basement with the notebook in her hands and the flashlight cutting across the cramped old handwriting, and felt something shift inside her that was not like anything she'd felt all week. It was not the manageable unease of the last several days. It was something colder and more final. She had been telling herself all week that she was dealing with something strange but bounded, something that could be documented and categorized and eventually explained. The notebook told her that someone else had tried exactly that in this exact house and had not finished the sentence they were writing. She carried the notebook upstairs and set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light and read it again from the beginning more carefully this time. The early entries were detailed in the same way her own notes were detailed. Observations, times, descriptions of the children and their positioning and their voices. The person who wrote it had been methodical at first. They had tried to find explanations the same way she had tried to find explanations. They had made calls to people who did not believe them. They had done research that led them in circles. The middle entries were where the tone started to change. The writer described a feeling of being watched during the day, not just at night. They described sounds from the back of property after midnight that were not the children knocking, but something else moving through the tree line without quite making the sounds that wind or animals would make. They described waking up to find that things inside the house had shifted slightly. A chair moved a few inches. A cabinet door left open that they were certain they had closed. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could not be explained away one item at a time. But the accumulation of it across the middle entries painted a picture of a person who had stopped sleeping and started spending their nights sitting in the kitchen with the lights on. Avery read that section slowly and did not look at the window above the sink while she read it. The later entries were harder to follow. The handwriting compressed, and the sentences lost their structure. There were dates missing. There were words crossed out and rewritten. There was one entry that was only a single line that said they are closer than last night and nothing else. Avery sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and the house quiet around her and thought about the fact that she was sitting in the same kitchen, in the same house, reading the account of someone who had experienced the same progression she was currently living through. She thought about what came after the last entry. She thought about the sentence that stopped mid-word. She sat with that for a long time, and then she closed the notebook and put it beside her laptop and looked at the front door from across the room. The porch light was off. She reached over and turned it on without getting up from her chair. The window above the sink showed nothing but the dark yard beyond the glass. She checked the time. It was not yet 9. She had at least 2 hours before they came, and she used that time to go back online and read every account she had skipped earlier in the day. She read the ones that ended badly. She read the ones where the poster described what happened after they stopped posting for a while. She read the ones where someone else came back to a thread to say that the person who had started it was no longer reachable. She read the responses at the bottom of every thread, where someone told the poster to pray, and she felt the contempt she had felt that morning. But it was quieter this time, and she could not tell if that was because she had grown used to seeing it or because something else was changing in her, without her permission. She closed the laptop at 10:30 and sat in the silence of the kitchen and waited. Sunday morning, Avery sat at the kitchen table with the notebook from the basement and her own notes file open side by side, and made a decision that she had been circling around for 2 days. She needed to talk to someone who would not immediately try to talk her out of what she was describing. Ray had already proven himself useless on that front, and she had not called anyone else because there was no one else. She was close enough to that the conversation would not have felt like an admission of something she was not ready to admit. But there was Gil. Gil lived about a half-mile down the road in a farmhouse older than hers, and she had met him twice since moving in. Once when he had stopped at the end of her driveway to introduce himself the week she arrived, and once when she had walked the road in the early evening, and he had been working on a fence post near the property line. He was somewhere in his late 60s with the kind of quiet steadiness that came from spending a lifetime in the same place. He had mentioned a church the second time. They spoke in a way that was not pushy, but was clearly central to how he organized his days. At the time, she had noted it and filed it away as something they would simply not discuss. Now she pulled on her jacket and drove the half-mile to his driveway and knocked on his door. He answered quickly and looked at her face and did not ask any preliminary questions before stepping back to let her in. She sat at his kitchen table and told him everything starting from Wednesday night, and he listened without interrupting and without the expression that Ray had wore on the phone, which was the expression of someone waiting for the story to be over, so they could offer the sensible explanation. Gil listened the way someone listens when they already believe what they are hearing is possible. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked her if she had let them in, and she said no, and something in his posture shifted slightly, like he had been holding a breath he could now release. He told her that was the most important thing. He told her that whatever they were, they operated on permission, and that the doorway was the line they could not cross without it. She asked him how he knew that, and he said he had heard accounts before, and that his understanding was that there were things in the world that worked by rules most people did not know existed until they were already in the middle of something they could not explain. She wanted to push back on that. The part of her that had spent 34 years building a life on evidence and reason wanted to point out that he was describing a framework with no verifiable foundation. But she had a notebook from a previous owner sitting on her kitchen table with a sentence that stopped mid-word, and she had 4 nights of documentation that had not resolved into anything she could close the file on. She asked him what she should do. He told her to call him the next time they came and not to open the door under any circumstances, and that he would come down and they would figure out the next step together. She drove home feeling something she did not have a precise word for. It was not relief exactly because the situation had not changed. It was more like the feeling of not being the only person in the room with the problem anymore. That feeling lasted until Monday evening, when she called Gil's number at 8:30 to tell him the children would be coming soon, and he did not answer. She tried twice more over the next hour. No answer. She told herself he was an older man who went to bed early and had likely left his phone somewhere he could not hear it. She checked the front door lock and sat down to wait. The knock came at 11, and when she turned on the porch light and looked through the narrow window, she counted 6 of them spread across the porch and down the steps and onto the dead grass below. 6 sets of black eyes aimed up at the window with that same flat, patient expression that had no childhood in it at all. She stood at the window longer than usual, scanning their faces and their positions, and noting how much closer the outermost children were to the house than they had been 2 nights ago. The progression was accelerating. She told them no through the glass, and none of them spoke this time. That was new. On every previous night, one of them had responded to her refusal with the same flat request to come inside. Tonight, they just stood there in the porch light, and looked at her and said nothing at all, and somehow the silence was worse than the asking had been. She stepped back from the window and tried Gil again. No answer. She tried Ray, and he picked up on the second ring, and she told him she needed him to come, and he told her he was not going to drive 4 hours in the middle of the night because she was seeing things and that she should call a doctor in the morning. She ended the call and stood in the hallway and listened to the silence from the porch and felt the full weight of being completely alone with to settle onto her chest. She did her lock check and went through every room on the ground floor, and then went upstairs and checked the windows up there too, and then came back down and sat at the kitchen table and waited for morning. She woke up in a chair at 3 a.m. with her neck stiff and the house dark around her, and reached over to turn on the kitchen light. She sat up and rubbed her eyes, and that was when she noticed the back door handle. It was a lever-style handle, and it was pointing down at an angle it had not been pointing at when she checked it before sitting down. She stared at it for a long moment, without moving. She had checked that door. She had checked it deliberately, and she remembered the handle being level, because she had pressed down on it to confirm the lock was engaged. It was not level now. She got up slowly and crossed the kitchen, and looked at the handle without touching it, and then looked at the lock above it, which was still turned to the lock position. The lock had not moved. Only the handle had. She stood in the kitchen at 3 a.m. looking at a door handle that had moved without anyone touching it from the inside, and felt the cold spread outward from her sternum in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She checked every other door and window in the house without finding anything else out of place, and then sat back down at the table and did not sleep again. In the gray light of Tuesday morning, she went to the ground floor one more time and found it in the living room. On the inside surface of the window that faced the side yard, there was a handprint in the condensation on the glass. It was small, child-sized. It was on the inside of the glass. She stood in front of that window for a long time and looked at the print and thought about what it meant, and could not find a version of events that explained it that did not require her to accept something she had been refusing to accept since Wednesday. She tried Gil again. Still no answer. She drove to his house in the late morning and knocked on his door and got no response, and tried the door and found it unlocked and pushed it open and called his name into the quiet of his house. The kitchen was empty. A mug of coffee sat on the table cold and half-finished, as though he had stood up from it mid-drink and not come back. His truck was in the driveway. His phone was on the kitchen counter. She stood in his doorway and looked at the cold coffee and the phone, and felt the last structure she had been leaning on give way entirely. She drove back to her own house and went straight to the basement and stood at the bottom of the stairs with her phone flashlight sweeping the room. In the far corner near the old workbench, she found a cardboard box she had not noticed before, partly hidden behind the rusted tool chest. She pulled it out and opened it and found two things inside. A wooden cross about the length of her forearm, worn smooth from years of handling. A Bible with a cracked spine and pages, so well used they had gone soft at the edges. She picked them both up and stood in the cold basement and held them, and did not know what she was holding them for, except that she was alone in a house that something had already found a way into, and she had run out of every other option she had ever trusted. She carried both items upstairs and set them on the kitchen table, and stood back and looked at them under the overhead light. The cross was old hardwood darkened from years of contact with skin, and the grain of it had a worn quality that spoke of someone carrying it through a long time. The Bible had a name written in faded ink on the inside cover that she could not fully make out, and pages that fell open naturally at certain passages, the way pages do when a book has been read in the same places many times. She did not open it beyond the cover. She was not ready for that. She set it back down and picked up the cross instead, and turned it over her hands and felt the weight of it, which was more substantial than she expected for the size. She set it down next to the Bible and sat in the chair across from them and looked at them and thought about the handprint on the inside of the window glass. She thought about the door handle pointing down at 3 a.m. She thought about Gil's cold coffee and his phone sitting on his counter and his truck in the driveway and no Gil anywhere in the house or the yard. She thought about every forum thread she had read, where someone said only God could protect them now, and how she had felt reading that, and how she felt now sitting in her kitchen with a cross and a Bible on the table in front of her and no one left to call. She did not pick them up again that night. She sat with them on the table and kept the kitchen light on and waited for the knock that she knew was coming, and when it came just before 11, she did not go to the window. She sat at the table and looked at the cross and the Bible and listened to the silence that followed the knocking and felt the house pressing around her from all sides and told herself she was not ready yet. She was not sure what she was waiting to be ready for. But she sat there in the light with her hands flat on the table, on either side of the cross and the Bible, and did not move until well past midnight, when the silence outside had held long enough that she allowed herself to believe they had gone for the night. Wednesday morning arrived with flat, colorless sky, and Avery had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since Sunday. She sat at the kitchen table with the cross and the Bible still in front of her, where she had left them the night before, and looked at them in the pale morning light, and tried to think clearly. The cross sat on the left and the Bible sat on the right, and they had been sitting there since she brought them up from the basement, and she had not touched either one since setting them down. She was not sure what she had expected to happen by having them on the table. She was not sure she had expected anything. She had carried them up because she was a woman who had run out of moves, and picking them up had felt like doing something even if she could not explain what. She poured coffee and sat back down and looked at the window above the sink and thought about the handprint on the living room glass. She had not gone back into that room since finding it. She had been moving through the house in a smaller and smaller circuit over the last 2 days, keeping to the kitchen and the upstairs bedroom and the bathroom, and avoiding the rooms that faced the side and back of the property. She knew that was not a sustainable strategy. She knew that whatever was happening was not going to stop because she changed her traffic pattern through the house. She drank her coffee and looked at the cross and thought about what it represented and felt a familiar resistance rise in her chest the way it always did when she came close to the subject of religion. She had built that resistance over a lifetime, and it was load-bearing in the architecture of who she was. She was not interested in dismantling it because she had run into something she could not explain. Plenty of things were unexplainable, without God being the explanation. She set her mug down and picked up the cross, and turned it over in her hands the way she had the night she found it. The wood was warm from the kitchen air, and the grain was smooth, and the weight of it settled into her palm in a way that felt more solid than she expected. She set it back down. She picked up the Bible and held it without opening it, and felt the soft, worn edges of the pages against her fingers. She set it back down, too. She was not going to sit at her kitchen table reading the Bible, because a few frightened people on the internet had told her to. She was going to find another way through this. She spent the morning trying to find another way. She read everything she had not already read online, and found nothing new that helped. She tried calling Gil 4 more times and got nothing. She looked up the non-emergency police line and sat with her phone for 10 minutes, constructing the version of events that a police officer would take seriously, and concluded there was no such version. She had a handprint on the inside of her window, and a neighbor who was not answering his door, and a door handle that had moved overnight. And none of those things were illegal, and none of them were things she could describe to a dispatcher without hearing the long pause on the other end that preceded the gentle suggestion that she speak to someone. She put the phone down. By afternoon, she had walked the perimeter of the property twice, looking at the tree line in the daylight, trying to map the space between the house and the road on the other side of the woods. The trees were dense enough that she could not see through them from where she stood. She did not know how wide the wood was on the back end of the property or what was on the other side of it. She had never had a reason to go into it before. She stood at the edge of the dead grass where the tree line began and looked into the dark space between the trunks and told herself she was going to need to know that information very soon. She went back inside when the light started to drop and sat at the table and watched the cross and the Bible sit there, and did nothing until 9 in the evening, when she heard the first sound from the front of the house. It was not a knock. It was a slow, dragging sound along the outside wall near the front window, as though something was trailing its hand across the siding while walking past. She sat very still and listened to it move from the front corner of the house toward the door and stop. Then the knock came. 3 slow knocks, the same as always. She did not go to the window. She sat at the table and picked up the cross with her right hand and held it and did not move toward the door. The knock came again, then silence, then the sound of the handle on the front door moving. She heard it clearly from where she was sitting, the lever dropping and lifting twice in slow succession, like something testing whether the mechanism would give. The lock held. The silence after it was different from the silences before it. It had a weight and a proximity that made the air in the kitchen feel closer. She was sitting at the table with the cross in her hand when she felt the shift in the room that she could not explain in physical terms. It was a pressure, not against her skin, but somewhere inside the space she occupied, like the air had developed an intention. She looked at the cross in her hand, and without making a decision about it, she raised it in the direction of the front of the house and held it out at arm's length. The pressure changed. It did not disappear, but it pulled back slightly the way a flame pulls back from a draft. She sat with her arm extended and her heart going hard in her chest and kept the cross pointed toward the front of the house. After 2 minutes, the pressure receded enough that she could breathe normally again. She lowered her arm and sat with the cross in her lap and stared at the kitchen wall. She did not have a framework for what had just happened. She did not have a category to put it in. She picked up the Bible with her left hand and held both items in her lap and sat in the kitchen light and thought about the previous night's knock and the night before that and the night before that and the slow, steady approach of something that had been mapping its way toward her door in careful, deliberate increments for more than a week. She opened the Bible. She opened it to the place it fell open naturally, which was somewhere in the middle, and she looked at the page without reading it, and then she started reading it. She read out loud because sitting in silence felt suddenly like a vulnerability she could not afford. Her voice was flat, and she was not reading with any feeling behind the words, because she was not reading them as anything other than text on a page. She was reading them the way she would read assembly instructions or the terms of a lease. She was using her voice to fill the room with something other than silence. She read for 10 minutes before she noticed that the pressure she felt earlier had not returned. She read for 20 minutes before she acknowledged to herself that the house felt different while she was reading than it had felt before she started. She kept reading. She read until midnight, and the knock did not come again that night. She sat with that fact for a long time after she stopped reading and turned it over in her mind and tried to find a version of it that did not mean what it appeared to mean. She could not find that version. She sat in the kitchen with the cross on the table and the Bible open in front of her and thought about the shape of the woods behind the property and how wide they might be and what was on the other side of them. She thought about the journal in the basement with a sentence that stopped mid-word. She thought about Gil's cold coffee. She thought about holding the cross out toward the front of the house and feeling the pressure pull back. She opened the Bible again and read 3 more pages and then closed it and looked at the tree line to the back window and began to plan. She went to the back door and unlocked it and stood in the open doorway with the cross in one hand and looked at the tree line about 40 feet from where she stood. The dead grass between the house and the trees was flat and open with no cover. She would be exposed crossing it. She looked at the darkness between the trunks and listened and heard nothing moving in there. She closed the door and locked it and went back to the table and opened the notebook from the basement and read the early entries again, looking for anything the previous owner had written about the woods. There were 2 references. One mentioned hearing sounds from the tree line at night, which she had already read. The other was from an earlier entry that described a path through the back of the property that came out on a county road about a quarter-mile east. She read that twice. A county road a quarter-mile east meant other houses and other people, and a way out that did not go past the front of the property, where the children gathered every night. She looked at the back door and then at the Bible and thought about what she had tested, without meaning to test tonight. The cross had pushed something back. The reading had kept it away. Those were not things she was comfortable stating as facts, but they were things she had experienced, and she was a woman who dealt in what she had directly observed even when the observation broke every model she had ever built. She picked up the Bible and turned to the page that had fallen open at earlier and read the passage there slowly this time. Then she turned to another page and read that. Then another. She was not reading for comfort. She was not reading because she believed in the words the way the person who had worn these pages soft had believed in them. She was reading the way a person reads a map when they are lost. She was looking for the route out. She sat at the table reading until 2 a.m, and then closed the Bible and laid the cross on top of it and looked at the back window in the darkness beyond it and began working to the plan in her mind. She would go at night because the daylight had not stopped them, and the dark at least gave her the cover of the trees once she reached them. She would carry both the cross and the Bible, and she would read aloud the entire way through the woods, and she would not stop reading for any reason until she reached the county road. She did not know if it would work. She had one night of evidence that the reading kept them back, and she had a partial map of the route from a notebook written by someone who had not made it out. She sat with that reality and held it without flinching, because flinching was not going to help her. She set the cross back down on the Bible and turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs and lay down without undressing, and stared at the ceiling, and let the plan take shape in her mind one step at a time until she was certain enough of it to close her eyes. She left on Thursday night at 10:30 before they arrived. She did not want to wait for them to be already gathered at the front of the house before she moved, because she did not know how far their awareness of her extended beyond the porch. She put on her heaviest jacket and her boots, and she tucked the cross into her inside pocket with the top of it extending above the zipper, so she could grab it instantly. She put the Bible in her other hand and did not put it down. She had been reading from it for the last 2 hours at the kitchen table, running through passages at random, pressing them into her memory, not because she thought memorizing them would help, but because the act of reading had kept the pressure in the house from building the night before, and she was going to use every advantage she had identified. She turned off every light in the house before going to the back door, so that no room would be lit from the outside, and draw attention to which door she was using. She stood at the back door in the dark for a moment with the Bible open to a page. She had been reading and read the passage aloud one more time in a low, steady voice. Then she unlocked the back door and opened it and stepped out into the cold. The night air hit her face, and she kept reading. She did not pause. She did not look toward the front of the house. She walked straight across the dead grass toward the tree line, reading from the page in front of her and holding the cross in her inside pocket with her left hand pressed against her chest over it. The 40 feet between the back door and the trees felt like a distance that kept expanding the more she walked it. She read and she walked, and she did not run, because running felt like a signal she did not want to send. She reached the tree line and pushed into the dark between the trunks and kept reading. The woods closed around her immediately, and the darkness inside them was a different quality than the darkness of the open yard. It was thick and directionless, and her phone flashlight was in her jacket pocket, and she could not use it without putting down the Bible, and she was not putting down the Bible. She read by memory for the first 20 steps until her eyes adjusted enough to make out shapes in the dark. The trees were close together, and the ground was uneven with roots and the remnants of undergrowth that had died back in autumn cold. She moved carefully and kept her voice steady and kept reading. She had gone perhaps 50 feet into the trees when she heard the first sound behind her. It was not a footstep. It was a disturbance in the air at the edge of the tree line, like something had crossed from the yard into the woods without weight but with presence. She did not turn around. She read louder. Her voice lifted in the dark between the trees, and she pushed out ahead of her like a thing that could clear the path, and she kept moving. She heard it again, closer this time and off to her left. Not a sound she could name, but a displacement of the silence that told her something was there. She raised the cross out of her pocket with her left hand and held it up and out to her left side, without stopping her reading and without looking. She felt the same pull-back of pressure she had felt in the kitchen 2 nights before. It receded from her left side, but she heard the displacement shift to her right, and she extended the cross to the right without lowering it and kept reading and kept walking. The ground sloped downward for a stretch, and she nearly lost her footing on a root she could not see and caught herself against a trunk and kept her voice going to the stumble without breaking the sentence she was reading. Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her throat. She held the Bible close to her face and read from the page, even though the darkness made the words nearly invisible, and when she lost a line, she moved to the next passage she had half memorized and kept her voice moving. Something was following her. She was certain of it. Not one something, but several, and they were staying at a distance that corresponded precisely with how far her voice was carrying through the trees. When her voice dropped, they came closer, and she could feel in the pressure on the air around her. When she raised her voice, they fell back. She understood the rule now with a clarity that had nothing academic about it. She was not safe. She was suspended. The reading was not a wall between her and them. It was a held breath. The moment she stopped, they would close the distance. She read and she walked and she counted her steps to keep her mind from spiraling into the fear that was building in her chest and pushing at the edges of her focus. She counted 50 and then started again. She counted 4 times before the trees began to thin and the darkness ahead of her took on a different quality. She could see gray space between the trunks where it would ended. She walked faster. She read faster. The sound behind her shifted and multiplied, and she could feel the pressure from multiple directions now pressing in toward her from both sides and from directly behind her, and she raised the cross straight up above her head and read at full voice, not caring any more about what she sounded like in the dark, because there was no one out here to hear her except the things that were following her, and she was not reading for them. She broke out of the tree line onto the gravel shoulder of a county road, and the open sky above her felt like something she had not earned but was receiving anyway. She kept reading. She stood on the gravel and turned and held the cross toward the tree line and read the passage she was on all the way to the end, and then turned to the next one and read that too. The tree line was dark and still. Nothing came out of the trees after her. She could not see anything in the dark between the trunks, but the pressure she had felt in the woods did not follow her onto the road. And after a full minute of standing on the gravel reading aloud, she felt it recede back into the dark of the trees, like a tide going out. She lowered the cross slowly and stood on the shoulder of the road and breathed. A quarter mile down the road, she could see the lights of a house. She walked toward it, still holding the Bible open and still reading in a low voice, because she was not ready to stop yet. She knocked on the door of the house, and a woman answered and looked at Avery's face and led her inside without asking a single question first, and that kindness broke something open in Avery that she had been holding shut since Wednesday of the week before. She sat at a stranger's kitchen table, and the woman made tea and did not push her to talk, and after a while Avery set the Bible down on the table in front of her and looked at it. She had been holding it for over an hour. Her hand ached from gripping it. She looked at the worn cover and the soft edges of the pages and thought about the person whose name was written in faded ink on the inside cover and what they had understood about the world that she had spent her whole life being too certain to consider. She had read those passages in the woods the same way she had read assembly instructions. She had used them as a tool without believing in the hand that had made the tool. She knew the difference now between those two things in a way she had not known before, and the knowing sat in her chest quietly, without fanfare, and without the triumphant clarity she might have expected if someone had described this moment to her a week ago. It was not triumph. It was something smaller and more permanent than triumph. She thought about every person she had ever dismissed for believing. She thought about the contempt she had carried for people who prayed, and the satisfaction she had taken in having no use for any of it. She thought about reading those form responses at her kitchen table and feeling superior to the people who had written them, and how that superiority had felt clean and reasonable at the time. She thought about Gil and his quiet steadiness and how he had listened to her, without the expression of someone waiting to correct her, and how she had driven to his house looking for exactly that quality and found his cold coffee and his phone on the counter. She did not know what had happened to Gil. She did not know if the person who had written that notebook had made it out or not. She did not know very much at all, compared to what she had thought she knew 8 days ago. The woman across the table asked if she was all right, and Avery said she did not think all right was the right description, but that she was here. She looked down at the Bible on the table in front of her and thought about the fact that she was here because of it, not because of her documentation, not because of her research, not because of her logic or her frameworks or her lifelong preference for things she could prove. She was sitting at this table in this warm kitchen because she had picked up a book she had spent 34 years treating as a symbol of other people's weakness, and she had read it out loud in the dark while something followed her through the trees, and it had worked. She sat with that for a long time. The woman refilled her tea and did not ask her to explain herself, and Avery was grateful for that more than she could have said. She put her hand flat on the cover of the Bible and left it there and looked out the window at the dark road beyond the glass, and thought about the person she had been 1 week ago, and how certain that person had been, and how much of that certainty was gone now, and how she was not sure she wanted it back. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the cross and set it on the table beside the Bible, and looked at the two objects side by side, and thought about whoever had put them in that box in the basement, and whether they had done it in hope or in desperation, or in both at once. She sat at the table long after the woman had gone to bed, and the house was quiet around her, and let herself sit with the full weight of what had carried her out of those woods. She had gone in with a plan built on observation, and she had come out because of something she could not measure or explain in any framework she had ever trusted. She was going to have to build something new. She was not sure yet what it would look like, but she was sitting at a table with the cross and the Bible within reach, and she was alive, and she thought that was the place to start.